So, as we attempt to explain the Neolithic, it really is the convergence of several factors. It's kind of like the perfect storm. And so, you've got to have sedentism, which is going to develop as a result of relatively rich environments that allowed for central place, broad spectrum foraging, right? You've got to have species that self pollinate, and that is because we didn't know a lot about the science of plant reproduction, and self pollinating species meant that really the only thing we had to do was water and harvest, right? So certainly some species are self-pollinating, others aren't. Most of these that are self-pollinating, I mean, we're talking about through wind or through insects, right? Um, eh, Domestication is only going to occur in areas that have, or at least the Neolithic emergence, in areas that have high species diversity, because you've got to have basically a lot to choose from. So if you're limited in either your species of animals or plants present, it's probably not going to happen. And then as climate changes and population growth occurs, this um, the need to be able to either spread your population to these marginal zones or the need to be able to keep up with your neighbors fuels this transition. So hunter-gatherer groups that live in the areas where food production is developed or has been brought there, hunter-gatherer groups end up having to adopt food production just to stay alive, just to not be outcompeted by farmers in the area. And so just file this away in the back of your mind because we are going to talk about making a living week after next and talk about the different what we call adaptive strategies or ways of producing food and how those influence many, many, many other aspects of culture. And we're gonna learn about foragers, horticulturalists, pastoralists, and agriculturalists. Okay, so the fact that hunter-gatherers really are almost forced to transition leads to the restriction of modern day foraging populations to only a few areas, and a few areas that have very specific ecological conditions. Once the knowledge to domesticate is present, domestication is not inevitable. And we already talked about the fact that foragers don't have to work as hard as agriculturalists, right? Foragers have extensive knowledge of their habitats. And so, in different ecologies, this leads to kind of different coupling of features. So, in Mesopotamia, of course, as soon as agriculture emerged, it rapidly spread and large states arose. In North America, the pickings were slimmer, and we didn't have that same broad, rich suite of both plants and animals. So that meant that that hunting and gathering were coupled with farming, so that we didn't just see an abrupt change in lifestyle from hunting and gathering to farming. That meant that the full, what we call a Neolithic economy, wasn't even possible until that last advance had been made with corn domestication, with maize domestication, right? That we had to get up to that level where it was more productive than foraging for mesquite pods. So it meant that kind of the, let's say, order of domestication was somewhat different, right? In the Middle East, in the Indus River Valley, etc. In China, the plants, the plants that were focused on were these carbohydrate staples. That's what was domesticated early. In the New World, it was these plants that offered some other benefit, like these bottle gourds, that were domesticated early. The geography of the East and the West also help predict the spread of Neolithic economies, right? And this diffusion of not only knowledge, but also the specific species. Europe and Asia can move east to west because you stay at a constant latitude. That's the bulk of the landmass. Things could be domesticated once and then spread rapidly. In North and South America, that's not going to be possible. In Africa, that's not going to be possible. So in Northern Africa, we do have Middle Eastern crops spread southward. But then once they basically reach the Sahara, right, then south of the Sahara, there's such a different ecology that Middle Eastern crops weren't like a perfect fit. That eventually halted the spread south of Middle Eastern crops. And so this is that diagram that shows these major axes, right? Europe and Asia, it's east-west. Africa and the Americas, it's mostly north-south. So in order to spread things widely, we've got to breed in pretty big genetic differences. They have to be able to deal particularly with a very different climate because temperature, day length, growing season, those are three big things that predict or vary predictably with changes in latitude. So as you move away from the equator, right, in the north or south direction, the growing season gets shorter, the day lengths change, etc. So what is now the United States? Domestication couldn't spread too far west because of the drier areas in West Texas and the southern Great Plains. Okay, so the plains were rich in bison, right? But then those bison were also consequentially hunted to extinction. It was really hard to develop the plains for agriculture. I don't know if you've ever seen. There's a picture that circulates periodically that looks at the root system of like a natural plain that would have been indicative of like the Great Plains for prior to what we consider the Dust Bowl, right? They had root systems that were extensive and deep and went down 8 to 10 feet in the ground at least. These grasses had super deep, super well developed root systems. So once we disrupted that and then came and planted crops like wheat across the Great Plains, it's one reason why the Dust Bowl occurred, right? Because of erosion from wind and water, because you didn't have that same depth of the root systems to stabilize the soil. So it's also affected then kind of their susceptibility to drought because the roots don't penetrate as deeply. So the Great Plains and West Texas stopped the spread of agriculture, and we had no suitable large animals for domestication. Those that we did have, we hunted to extinction because they weren't very wary of people. All right, so was agriculture a good thing? I mean, this is certainly something you have to consider, right? I mean, our entire economy is based off of the consumption of domesticated crops. So obviously, if we were to just take agriculture away right now, most of the world would starve. We wouldn't be able to support close to 8 billion people, right? Agriculture now is absolutely necessary. But is it a good thing for people when they adopt it? Well, good is relative. There are some benefits, there are also costs. Food production brought about advantages in terms of discovery and invention. So we learn how to spin and weave. We particularly and critically um, are able to start using plant sources for fabric. So it allows for more widespread production of clothes. We didn't have to rely on just using the hides of hunted game, for example, right? So we could spin and weave linen and cotton and flax. We see the discovery uh, the discovery and mastering of pottery and brick making, which allows us then to build structures from substances that are more stable. So we could build houses that could go even taller because we could base them out of bricks instead of basing them just out of grasses and wood, right? We also see the emergence of arched masonry, which becomes significant in terms of architectural features. We could kind of fit bricks to our kind of the need or something that was part of our aesthetic. We eventually developed smelting and casting metals, and this is allows for tools that last longer, that can be reforged and stuff. And so, in particular, iron work, right? The Bronze Age started roughly, I don't know, 5,500 or so years ago. A little bit more recent, the Copper Age, the Chalcolithic, was about 5,000 or so years ago. The Bronze Age follows out of that, and we can start to produce tools and jewelry and weapons and all of that. From substances that don't break quite as easily. But the Iron Age isn't ushered in until roughly about 3,000 years before present. And that is because iron smelting requires temperatures that are a lot hotter than working with copper and bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and either tin or now I can't think of it. It's not zinc, or maybe it is zinc. I don't know. I can't remember the other. Maybe it's arsenic. The other additive that goes in with copper to make bronze. Tin is the only one I can recall right now. So, smelting. Also, then those same techniques allow for art and um, architectural features, right? So, we have the search for precious metals with gold and silver. And knowing how to work with those materials kind of becomes a status or prestige thing. Trade and commerce. We start to build not only regional networks, but even long distance trade networks. We find things like macaw feathers in Chaco Canyon. That's because of trade from more tropical subtropical Mexico. We find seashells in places like the desert Southwest, again through trade. We start to develop kind of the precursor to what later becomes known as the Silk Road, which allowed for the movement of extremely limited luxury items like saffron, pepper, cinnamon, vanilla, and its namesake silk to populations as far west as Europe. So, by about 5,500 years before present, Middle Easterners were living in vibrant cities. Okay. But the new economy also brings a lot of hardships. Food producers work harder than foragers. They also have a less adequate diet. So, we've got, in foraging populations, though you may say you're hungry, you're not starving. You're not like critically food limited in most circumstances. So, you might feel hunger pains, but that doesn't mean that you're like close to dying. We start to see people die from interruptions in the food supply, let's say through pestilence or through drought or flood or something like that. Herds, fields, and irrigation systems need care. So basically, our changing food production pathways require us to innovate new jobs and to develop more infrastructure so that we can maintain all of those things. Food producers tend to have more children. That means we've got more childcare demands. This is the period really where we start to see young adolescent girls being funneled into childcare roles so that it's often the adolescent sisters of a child who are taking care of the child and doing a lot of the active childcare and parenting. And the division of economic labor grows more complex. This will eventually transition into um, social stratification, where the people who control and own the land are not the same people who are doing the physical labor to work the land. And that creates a whole kind of complex hierarchy that results in some really weird um, kind of cultural features, weird um, cultural behaviors like despots and such. We also see public health decline for a couple of reasons. The first is that the diet is less varied, so you don't have as much, let's say, you don't have as many limiting minerals and vitamins. Those that are only present in some plants, for example, right? So you might be low on vitamin C if you don't have access to things like citrus. You might be low in iron, depending on the soil that your food is grown in. Um, so having a varied diet is really important in terms of healthy growth and development and also a functional immune system. Um, Interestingly, it is with agriculture that we also see dental problems start to emerge, and this is also partly twofold, right? One of those is that um, we were eating a diet that was a lot higher in cereal grains, and cereal grains, when they're metabolized, are converted to sugar. So those starches basically flood our mouths with larger quantities of sugar. So we start to see things like what we call dental caries. That's the scientific word for cavities. We start to see cavities emerge because of a diet that is functionally higher in sugar. We also start to see what we call malocclusion, or teeth that don't line up right. And part of this is because of younger ages at weaning. And so, specifically, there's been some work done with captive macaques versus wild macaques that shows that those that are reared in captivity that start eating other kind of weaning foods earlier. And in captivity, it's specifically a product called monkey chow, which is produced by the Purina, was originally produced by Purina along with like cat chow and dog chow, right? Um, and so monkey chow can be softened by being dunked in water. And so a lot of primates won't eat the hard kibble, but will instead find their lick sticks or their water sources and soak it to soften it, which makes it also then kind of easily stolen or take acquired by infants as well. So because of that, those macaques in captivity stop nursing at younger ages and thusly don't have the muscle movement of suckling to allow for their teeth to fully develop kind of in the right way, let's say. Um, and so captive macaques have much higher incidence of teeth that don't align, their buck teeth, the underbite, overbite, all of that. The same can be said for humans. I mean, look at the degree to which we make use of orthodontia now, right? It used to be that everybody had teeth that were super straight, and a big driver of that was that everybody was nursing for 3 to 4 years. 3 to 4 years of suckling is a lot of muscle action that helps the palate spread far enough and gives plenty of room for all your teeth to grow. Once we shifted to agriculture, we started weaning our babies earlier because we had those cereal grains that we could feed them, and also because their mothers were working in the fields and it was their younger sisters taking care, or it was their older sisters taking care of them. So, in that situation, of course, mom's not close by to nurse. And it shouldn't surprise us now that it's almost epidemic level. I mean, I don't know if it's quite most, I haven't looked up the statistics on it, but many, many, many teenagers need orthodontia, need palate expanders, etc. And a lot of that is because we basically, I mean, we can wean at birth, right? That's essentially what we're doing when we don't breastfeed our babies and bottle feed them instead. We're weaning them from breast milk at birth, and that has a whole kind of string of consequences. Disease also spreads more easily in agriculture or food producing societies. A lot of that is because we're living in close quarters, right? So we've got high population density, and that means then that people are more likely to be face to face with one another. Also, it's rats contribute to it, right? Rats and mice like cereal grains, but they also bring with them their urine and their feces, and they bring fleas that also possess or harbor certain pathogens. And so, as cities grow, as populations expand, so too do the pests that they bring with them. So we've got this kind of coevolution of rats with human populations. So you get things like the bubonic plague and such. And then also, because we didn't have a good knowledge of what caused disease. And so cities are often built around rivers because the rivers provide the water for the agriculture that we need. But people also use those rivers for bathroom needs and bathing needs. And so, um, it's never a good idea to drink water from the water source that you also poop in, right? That is a natural or not a natural health, a public health nightmare. And so that's also partly responsible for higher disease transmission. Not only do we poop in it, but we throw our dead bodies in it, and our animals poop in it, and animals die in it, and things like that. So a lot of contamination, not a lot of focus on public health and kind of the movement of sewage and stuff. But then as we shift to agriculture, we have a greater degree of social inequality and poverty as well. And so the people who are working in the fields don't own the land, um, and often have to turn everything they produce over to the landowners, and consequently may not have enough to eat. Right. Poverty also forces people into even closer living conditions. We see this in New Mexico with an increasing feminization of poverty, right? It's single mothers that often fall at or below the poverty line economically. And in many cases, we see expanded families because of kind of economic needs. So, a woman and her sister may cooperatively share a household and raise their kids together because you need that dual income, but you may not have a two-parent family or household. The last cost here is the fact that the rate at which humans degrade their environments also increases with food production, because food production leads to more people, which then leads to the clearing of land to be able to cultivate more land to feed a larger number of people, which leads to a population boom, which then leads to the clearing of land, et cetera, et cetera. The other problem with clearing forest for agriculture is that kind of the soil and moisture of forests, particularly those in the tropics, is incredibly complex. And as soon as you strip away all of that vegetation and cultivate the land, it runs out of nutrients within about 5 years. Horticulturalists in tropical areas who practice swidden agriculture are able to get by this by abandoning fields and allowing them to lay fallow for years before you cultivate them again. They also are able to combat this through the slash and burn techniques, because when you cut down vegetation and burn it and then till the ashes into the soil, you're essentially fertilizing with especially a lot of nitrogen, which is important for growing fruits and flowers. All right, and so here kind of summarizes those previous slides. The benefits include discoveries and inventions. We get scientific advances. We get monumental architecture because we've got disposable income and lots of people to utilize for that. We get writing, mathematics, measures, trades and market, urban life, increased production, and more reliable crop yields. But at the same time, it requires harder work. We have less nutritious diets. We've got child labor and childcare demands, taxes in the military draft, public health declines, protein deficiency and dental caries, greater stress, social inequality and poverty, slavery, war, and increased environmental degradation. So, it's like any other change in culture. We get the good and we get the bad, and we kind of have to weigh the relative costs and benefits to decide if ultimately that was the right decision